Have you ever felt a connection so powerful it defied logic? A bond so deep that distance, time, and even species couldn't break it? What if I told you that in the mountains of Wyoming, a true story unfolded that would forever change how we understand loyalty? Today, I'm sharing the extraordinary journey of a girl named Sophie and a silver wolf called Luna, a tale of loss, courage, and a devotion so rare it became legend in a small mountain town. You'll discover how an orphan girl and an injured wolf found each other during the darkest of times, and the impossible choices they faced when the world tried to tear them apart. This isn't just another animal story. It's about what happens when the wild and human worlds collide, and the extraordinary lengths we'll go to protect those we love. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I read every single one, and your support helps stories like this reach more people. Now, settle in as we journey to the remote mountains of Wyoming, where our story begins with a lonely cabin, a grieving family, and a fateful winter storm that changed everything. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Sullivan cabin. Perched on the eastern slope of the Wyoming Rockies, the structure stood as defiant against time as its owner was against company. Garrett Sullivan moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had seen too much of the world to be rushed by it anymore. His tall frame, once soldier straight, now curved slightly at the shoulders, but his eyes, sharp blue beneath silver brows, missed nothing. "Sophie, daylight's burning, and that firewood won't stack itself," he called, his voice carrying across the clearing where his 11-year-old granddaughter was investigating something in the tall grass. Sophie looked up, her copper hair catching the fading sunlight. Unlike her grandfather, whose every movement seemed calculated, Sophie moved in bursts of energy, curious about everything the mountain offered. "Coming, Grandpa. Just found some interesting tracks here," she replied, reluctantly abandoning her discovery. The cabin and its surroundings had been Sophie's world for the past 3 years, ever since the night that Garrett received the call no parent should ever get. His son David, Sophie's father, and Rebecca, her mother, had been killed instantly when a drunk driver crossed into their lane on the icy highway. Garrett, already a widower, had left his solitary life to collect his shell-shocked granddaughter from a social worker in Denver. Neither had spoken much during the long drive back to the mountains. Sophie had stared out the window, clutching her backpack with white knuckles. Garrett had gripped the steering wheel with the same intensity. They were strangers bound by loss, retreating to the only place Garrett knew how to exist, away from everyone. Inside the cabin, warmth radiated from the wood stove. The interior was sparse but functional. Handmade furniture, shelves lined with books on survival and nature, walls adorned with a few faded photographs, and David's military medals displayed in a shadow box. Garrett's own service memorabilia remained packed away in a trunk under his bed, the memories too sharp to display. "Wash up for dinner," Garrett instructed as Sophie brought in the last armload of firewood. "Venison stew tonight." During their meal, Sophie watched her grandfather's weathered hands as he broke a piece of cornbread. The silence between them was comfortable now, unlike the early days of their shared grief. "Mr. Miller came by the cabin today while you were at your lessons with Mrs. Jameson," Garrett mentioned between bites. "Says there's a storm coming in. Might be the first big snow of the season." Sophie's eyes brightened. "Does that mean we'll track tomorrow? You promised to teach me how to read deer trails in fresh snow." A rare smile crossed Garrett's face. "If the snow comes as Miller predicts, we'll do just that." He paused, studying his granddaughter. "You're getting good at reading sign. Your dad would be proud." Sophie lowered her gaze to her bowl, the mention of her father both a comfort and a wound. "Do you think they would like who I'm becoming?" she asked softly. Garrett's voice gentled in a way reserved only for Sophie. "They'd recognize you anywhere, Wildflower. You've got your mother's curiosity and your father's stubbornness. God help us both." Later, as howling wind announced the approaching storm, Sophie sat by the window in her small bedroom. She opened her journal, something her school counselor had suggested to process her grief. 3 years in, and the pages were filled less with sadness and more with observations of mountain life, sketches of plants, notes on animal behavior, and the changing seasons in their high-altitude sanctuary. She wrote, "First big snow coming tonight. Grandpa says we'll track tomorrow. I hope to see wolf prints again. even though Grandpa says they hardly ever come this close to the cabin. Little did she know how soon her wish would come true. Morning broke with a world transformed. 8 inches of fresh powder blanketed the landscape, and fat flakes continued to fall from a pewter sky. The storm had delivered as promised, wrapping the Sullivan cabin in a cocoon of white silence. Sophie pressed her nose against the frosted window, her breath creating ghostly patterns on the glass. "Grandpa, it's perfect tracking snow," she called out, already reaching for her heavy boots. "Hold your horses," Garrett replied, stirring a pot of oatmeal on the wood stove. "Storm's not done with us yet. We'll head out after breakfast, and not a minute before." Sophie fidgeted through the meal, earning a stern look from her grandfather that silently communicated the importance of patience in mountain living. Finally, properly outfitted in layers of wool and waterproof gear, they stepped into the crystalline morning. "Remember," Garrett instructed as they moved into the forest, "observe everything, but disturb nothing. The snow tells stories for those who know how to read them." For 2 hours, grandfather and granddaughter followed the silent narratives written in the snow. The delicate trail of a snowshoe hare, the purposeful trek of a fox, the wandering path of a mule deer. Garrett pointed out subtle signs Sophie might have missed: a broken twig, bark stripped from a young aspen, the nearly invisible impression of an owl's wingtip where it had swooped down for prey. As they approached Cedar Creek, now partially frozen, the wind intensified. The temperature dropped sharply, and Garrett glanced at the darkening sky with concern. "We need to head back," he announced. "Weather's turning faster than I expected." "Just 5 more minutes," Sophie pleaded. "I want to see if there are any beaver signs by the bend." Reluctantly, Garrett nodded. 5 minutes. Not a second more. Sophie scampered ahead, following the creek's winding path. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks, her excited voice carrying back to her grandfather. "Grandpa, come quick." Garrett rushed forward, expecting trouble. Instead, he found Sophie kneeling beside a small, gray form half buried in snow near the creek bank. A wolf pup, no more than 4 months old, lay trembling, its right hind leg caught in the teeth of a wire snare. An illegal trap that made Garrett's jaw clench with anger. "She's still alive," Sophie whispered, already removing her outer mitten to check for a pulse. The pup's silver-gray fur was matted with blood around the snare, and its yellow eyes, though clouded with pain, tracked their movements warily. "Stand back, Sophie," Garrett warned. "Even a pup can be dangerous when injured." "We can't leave her," Sophie insisted, her voice breaking. "She'll die out here." The pup made a feeble attempt to growl, but could only manage a whimper that seemed to pierce straight through to Sophie's heart. Garrett surveyed the area, noting the absence of adult wolf tracks. "Packs likely moved on. They can't wait for the week." His experienced eyes assessed the situation. "That trap's been illegal in this county for years. Damn poachers." With practiced movements, Garrett removed the leatherwork gloves from his belt. "I'll free her from the snare. You stay clear until I'm sure she won't bite." Working methodically, Garrett disabled the trap's mechanism. The pup flinched, but was too weak to fight as he carefully extracted the injured leg from the wire's grip. "She's got a deep gash, probably some tissue damage," he reported. "Won't make it through the night in this cold." Sophie's eyes welled with tears. "Please, Grandpa. We have to try." Garrett looked from his granddaughter to the injured pup, seeing reflections of loss in both pairs of eyes. The wind howled through the trees, bringing with it the promise of more snow and plummeting temperatures. With a resigned sigh, he removed his scarf and gently wrapped it around the trembling animal. "This goes against every bit of sense I've got," he muttered, lifting the bundle carefully. "Your grandmother always said I was a fool for strays. Seems you inherited that particular weakness." As they hurried back toward the cabin, Sophie spotted a distinctive mark on the pup's chest, a crescent-shaped patch of white fur against the silver gray. "Look, Grandpa," she whispered. "She's got a moon on her chest." "Luna," Sophie decided, her voice firm with newfound purpose. "Her name is Luna." "You're spoiling that animal," Garrett grumbled, watching Sophie carefully feed small pieces of venison to the recovering wolf pup. 6 weeks had passed since the rescue, and Luna's transformation was remarkable. The once skeletal frame now carried healthy muscle, and her silver-gray coat gleamed with vitality. "I'm not spoiling her," Sophie countered, her tone playful but determined. "I'm rehabilitating her, like Dr. Wilson's book says." She gestured toward the veterinary manual that had become her Bible since Luna's arrival. When they'd first brought the injured pup home, Garrett had been certain she wouldn't survive the night. The wound from the snare had been deep, requiring careful cleaning and stitches that Garrett applied with surprisingly gentle hands, skills he'd learned as a field medic decades earlier. "Never thought I'd be using Army medical training on a wolf," he'd muttered as Sophie held a flashlight steady over his work. Those first days had been touch and go. Sophie had slept on the floor beside the box they'd prepared for Luna, waking every few hours to check on her, coaxing water into the pup with an eyedropper. Garrett, despite his gruff exterior, had made calls to a wildlife veterinarian in the nearest town, meticulously following instructions for wound care and nutrition. Now, as spring thawed the mountain, Luna had become an undeniable presence in their lives. She moved with increasing confidence around the cabin, her injured leg healing with only a slight hitch in her gait. The wolf's golden eyes, once dulled with pain, now watched everything with intelligent interest. "She needs to run," Sophie announced one morning, looking up from her breakfast. "She's cooped up too much. Dr. Wilson's book says wolves need miles of territory." Garrett lowered his coffee mug. "She's not a pet, Sophie. You understand that, right? She's wild, no matter how tame she seems now." "I know." Sophie nodded seriously. "But she needs exercise to strengthen her leg properly." That afternoon, Garrett fashioned a long lead from paracord, creating something that would give Luna freedom to move while keeping her from bolting. They needn't have worried. When Sophie led the young wolf outside, Luna stayed close, only venturing away to investigate interesting scents before returning to the girl's side. As the weeks passed, Luna grew rapidly, her pup proportions giving way to the elegant lines of a young adult wolf. By summer, she stood nearly 30 inches at the shoulder, her winter coat shedding to reveal sleeker silver-gray fur. The crescent moon marking on her chest remained distinct, a white badge against the darker background. "She's magnificent," Eleanor Jameson, Sophie's teacher, remarked during her monthly visit to deliver schoolwork. The older woman watched through the cabin window as Sophie and Luna moved in tandem across the clearing, the wolf responding to subtle gestures from the girl. "I've never seen anything like it." "Neither have I," Garrett admitted, his weathered face betraying a mixture of pride and concern. "She should be with her own kind." But he trailed off, unable to articulate the complicated reality they faced. The connection between Sophie and Luna deepened with each passing day. The wolf seemed to sense the girl's moods, pressing close during moments of sadness that still occasionally overwhelmed Sophie when memories of her parents surfaced. In turn, Sophie's natural intuition allowed her to recognize Luna's needs when she required space, exercise, or quiet companionship. One evening, as sunset painted the mountains in amber and gold, Sophie sat on the porch steps writing in her journal. Luna lay nearby, her head resting on paws that now bore the size and strength of adulthood. Garrett watched from the doorway as Sophie closed her book and gazed at the distant peaks. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked, settling beside her on the worn wooden step. "Luna heard wolves last night," Sophie replied. "She stood at my window for the longest time, just listening." Garrett nodded. "There's a pack that ranges about 10 miles north. Probably what she heard." "Did she answer them?" His question carried weight they both understood. "No." Sophie leaned against her grandfather's shoulder. "She just listened. Then she came back to bed and slept right next to me." She paused, struggling with the question she'd been avoiding. "Will she leave us someday, Grandpa? To find other wolves?" Garrett wrapped an arm around his granddaughter, choosing his words carefully. "Luna will make her own choices, Wildflower. That's the thing about wild creatures. We don't own their hearts. We just borrow their company for a while." As if understanding the conversation, Luna rose and moved to Sophie, placing her massive head in the girl's lap with a sigh that seemed almost human in its contentment. "I think," Garrett said softly, observing the pair, "she's already made her choice." Pine Ridge sat nestled in a valley 20 miles from the Sullivan cabin, a place where mountain people came to trade, gather supplies, and exchange the currency of small-town life: information. With its single main street lined with false-fronted buildings dating back to the 1890s mining boom, the town appeared frozen in time, except for the satellite dishes discreetly mounted on rooftops and the high-speed internet that connected this remote outpost to the wider world. Garrett Sullivan avoided town whenever possible, making monthly trips for necessities and little else. Today, however, Sophie accompanied him, her first visit since Luna had entered their lives 6 months earlier. Remember, not a word about Luna, Garrett reminded as they parked his weathered Ford pickup in front of Wilson's General Store. Far as anyone needs to know, we're just living our quiet life up on the mountain. Sophie nodded solemnly, though she longed to share stories of Luna with someone beyond her grandfather. The wolf, now nearly full-grown, had remained at the cabin, secured in the fenced area Garrett had constructed behind the house, a compromise that had taken weeks of negotiation between grandfather and granddaughter. Inside Wilson's, Sophie wandered the aisles while Garrett discussed an order of fencing supplies with Tom Wilson, the third-generation proprietor. "Sullivan, didn't expect to see you until the first snow," called Eleanor Jameson, Sophie's former teacher, as she entered the store. The retired educator approached with a warm smile. "And Sophie, my goodness, you've grown 3 inches since I saw you last." Sophie smiled shyly. Mrs. Jameson had tutored her during that first difficult year after her parents' death, when attending the local school had proved too overwhelming. "How are your studies coming along?" Mrs. Jameson asked, genuinely interested in her former pupil's progress. "Very well," Sophie replied. "I'm ahead in science and reading, though math is still challenging." "She's got a good head on her shoulders," Garrett interjected, protective pride evident in his voice. The bell above the door jingled as Howard Bennett entered, followed by his son Travis. Bennett, whose cattle ranch bordered public lands near the Sullivan property, nodded curtly in Garrett's direction, the closest thing to a greeting the two men exchanged. "Sullivan," Bennett acknowledged, his voice carrying through the store. "Heard some interesting news from Miller when he was checking my north fence line. Says there've been wolf tracks up near Cedar Creek. Near your place." Sophie tensed, her fingers tightening around the notebook she'd been showing Mrs. Jameson. "Wolves have always been in these mountains," Garrett replied evenly. "Long before cattle or people." Bennett's face hardened. "Lost 2 calves last spring to predators. Wildlife Service confirmed wolf kills. Those were 30 miles southwest of here," Mrs. Jameson interjected, her tone pleasant but firm. "Different territory entirely." "A wolf's a wolf," Bennett countered. "And I don't take kindly to threats to my livelihood." "Nobody's threatening anything," Garrett said, his voice remaining level despite the tension evident in his stance. "Sophie, go pick out some books from the shelf Tom keeps for you." Sophie moved reluctantly toward the small collection of used books at the back of the store, but remained within earshot. "That girl of yours spends too much time alone in those mountains," Bennett continued, lowering his voice, but not enough. "Miller says he saw her running with something big and gray a few weeks back. Said it looked like a wolf, but that'd be crazy, wouldn't it?" Garrett's expression revealed nothing. Miller's eyesight isn't what it used to be. Probably saw Sophie with a dead tree branch. She collects interesting wood for her projects. Bennett's skeptical expression made it clear he wasn't convinced. "Just so we're clear, Sullivan, if I find wolf sign on my property, I'm within my rights to protect my stock. Wyoming law's on my side." "Your property's your business," Garrett replied. "What happens on mine is mine." Later, as they drove the winding road back toward the cabin, Sophie broke the heavy silence. "They'll hurt Luna if they find out about her, won't they?" Garrett's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Some might try. Bennett's not the whole town, though." "Mrs. Jameson wouldn't," Sophie said. "She likes wolves. She told me once they're essential to the ecosystem." Garrett glanced at his granddaughter, noting the worry creasing her young brow. "The world's divided into 2 kinds of people, Wildflower. Those who see beauty in wild things, and those who only see threat. Problem is, the second group tends to be louder." As they rounded the final bend toward home, a silver form loped alongside the fence line, tracking their arrival. Luna's distinctive silhouette, now unmistakably that of an adult wolf, paused as the truck approached, her tail swaying in recognition. "We need to be more careful," Garrett said, watching the magnificent animal through the windshield. "Keep her closer to the cabin. No more runs in the open meadow where someone might spot you both." Sophie nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. Their secret, their family, had just become more vulnerable, and the cocoon of safety they'd created suddenly seemed as fragile as a spider's web in a storm. The first sign came on an October morning, a cough that rattled too deeply in Garrett's chest, lingering long after it should have cleared. Sophie noticed, but said nothing, having learned from her grandfather that certain concerns were best left unspoken until they demanded attention. By December, the cough had become Garrett's constant companion, punctuating conversations and disturbing the night's quiet. On a crisp afternoon when frost etched delicate patterns across the cabin windows, Sophie found him leaning heavily against the woodpile, his face ashen beneath his weathered tan. "Just catching my breath," he dismissed when she hurried to his side. "Altitude gets to even the oldest mountain folks sometimes." "You need to see Dr. Ramirez," Sophie insisted, her voice carrying a maturity beyond her 11 years. "I can radio Mr. Miller to drive us to town." Garrett straightened with effort. "We're not bothering Miller. I'll be fine after some rest." Luna, now a magnificent adult wolf standing 30 inches at the shoulder with a thick winter coat that gleamed silver in the sunlight, approached cautiously. Since that summer day when rumors began in town, Garrett had constructed a spacious enclosure connected to the woodshed, a necessary precaution that both he and Sophie resented. Still, Luna spent most days free to roam the immediate surroundings of the cabin under their watchful eyes, returning to the secure area only when necessary. Now, the wolf pressed her massive head against Garrett's leg, a gesture so gentle it nearly broke Sophie's heart. Luna had begun doing this weeks ago, as if sensing the weakness Garrett worked so hard to conceal. "See," Garrett attempted a laugh that dissolved into another coughing fit. "Even the wolf thinks I'm getting soft." That night, Sophie woke to find Luna standing alert by her bedroom door, golden eyes fixed on her with unmistakable intent. Following the wolf down the hallway, Sophie discovered Garrett sitting upright in his bed, struggling for breath, his fingers clutching at his chest. "Grandpa," she cried, rushing to his side. "Get the radio," he managed between gasps. "Call Miller." The next 12 hours passed in a blur of fear and activity. Tom Miller, their closest neighbor at 5 miles distant, arrived in his 4-wheel drive, chains already mounted for the winter roads. Luna had been secured in her enclosure, watching with anxious eyes as Garrett was helped into Miller's vehicle. "You stay here," Garrett had insisted to Sophie. "I'll have Miller's wife check on you tomorrow." "I'm coming with you," Sophie replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Luna has food and water. She'll be okay for a day." At the small regional hospital in Jackson, 40 miles from Pine Ridge, the diagnosis confirmed what Sophie had feared. Pneumonia, complicated by a condition the doctor called COPD, not uncommon in veterans who served where burn pits were used, Dr. Ramirez explained gently. "How long has he been struggling to breathe?" she asked Sophie while Garrett underwent tests. "It's gotten worse the past month," Sophie admitted. "But he's been coughing since fall." Dr. Ramirez's expression softened with understanding. "Your grandfather is very strong, but his lungs have been damaged for some time. This isn't something that just appeared." When Garrett was finally admitted for treatment, Sophie sat beside his hospital bed, her small hand engulfing his larger one that now seemed somehow diminished against the white sheets. "You should have told me," she said quietly. Garrett's eyes, still sharp despite his weakened state, met hers. "Didn't want you worrying." "That's not how family works," Sophie replied, echoing words he had once spoken to her. "We carry each other's burdens. You taught me that." A ghost of a smile crossed his pale lips. "Using my own words against me. You're too smart for an old soldier." 3 days later, they returned to the cabin with medication, oxygen tanks, and strict instructions for rest. Luna's joyous greeting was tempered by her immediate sense that something had changed. She approached Garrett carefully, sniffing the hospital scent that clung to him, then settled at his feet as he eased into his favorite chair. As winter deepened, so did Garrett's struggle. On good days, he moved slowly around the cabin, teaching Sophie tasks he'd previously handled, maintaining the generator, reading weather patterns, repairing basic equipment. On bad days, he remained in bed, his breathing labored despite the oxygen that flowed through the plastic tubing beneath his nose. "You're doing too much," he observed one evening as Sophie prepared dinner, having already chopped wood, fed Luna, and completed her schoolwork. "You're 11, not 30. Sophie stirred the venison stew, a recipe her grandmother had passed down. "I'm almost 12, she corrected. "And I'm just doing what needs doing." In the corner, Luna lay watchful, her protective instincts now extended equally to both humans. At night, She alternated where she slept, sometimes at Sophie's bedside, other nights curled near Garrett's door, as if standing guard against the inevitable. February brought a brief reprieve. Garrett rallied enough to sit on the porch on milder days, Luna lying at his feet, while Sophie read aloud from Jack London's Call of the Wild, a choice that brought a knowing smile to Garrett's face. Life's got a sense of humor, hasn't it? He mused, watching Luna's ears prick at every sound from the forest. Here I am, listening to stories about wild things choosing freedom, while we've got the real thing choosing to stay. Sophie marked their place in the book. Luna's free to go whenever she wants. The enclosure gate hasn't been latched in months. Garrett nodded. She stays for you, Wildflower. Some bonds run deeper than blood or species. He reached for her hand, his grip weaker than before, but still secure. Remember that when things change. Sophie understood the conversation beneath the words, the one they'd been having in different ways since his return from the hospital. I'm not afraid, she told him, trying to believe it herself. I know, he replied softly. That's what worries me. The March night that took Garrett Sullivan arrived quietly, like a thief slipping through an unlocked door. Sophie woke with a sense of wrongness that sent her padding down the hallway, Luna a silent shadow at her heels. The wolf had been restless all evening, pacing between Sophie's room and Garrett's, her behavior unsettling enough that Sophie had finally fallen asleep with one hand buried in Luna's thick fur. In the soft glow of the nightlight, Sophie found her grandfather in his recliner by the dormant wood stove, a book open on his lap, his reading glasses still perched on his nose. His oxygen tank stood nearby, the plastic tubing draped loosely over the armrest. He looked peaceful, more relaxed than he had in months, but the stillness about him was absolute. Grandpa, she whispered, though she already understood. Luna moved forward, pressing her massive head against Garrett's limp hand, then releasing a soft whine that carried more emotion than Sophie had ever heard from the wolf. When there was no response, Luna sat back on her haunches and lifted her face toward the ceiling, releasing a mournful howl that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's very bones. Sophie didn't cry, not then. Instead, she gently removed her grandfather's glasses, closed his book, and covered him with the quilt her grandmother had made decades earlier. Then she sat on the floor beside his chair, one arm around Luna, and waited for dawn. When first light brightened the eastern windows, she reached for the radio. Mr. Miller, she said when the familiar voice answered. It's Sophie Sullivan. My grandfather. He's gone. The small community responded with the efficiency born of rural necessity. Tom Miller arrived within the hour, followed by Sheriff Rivera, whose gentle professionalism gave Sophie something solid to focus on while the necessary arrangements were made. Dr. Ramirez, who had been treating Garrett since their hospital visit, drove from Jackson to officially confirm what everyone already knew. Garrett Sullivan's damaged lungs had finally failed him. He went peacefully, the doctor assured Sophie as they sat at the kitchen table. In his sleep, without struggle. It's what we all hope for when the time comes. Luna had been secured in her enclosure before the first vehicle arrived, something Sophie had done automatically, protecting the wolf as Garrett had taught her. Now, as voices filled the once quiet cabin, Luna paced the perimeter of her space, her golden eyes tracking every movement through the windows. Eleanor Jameson arrived by mid-morning, taking charge of Sophie with quiet authority. You'll stay with me in town until we sort things out, she informed the girl, already packing a small bag of essentials. I can't leave Luna, Sophie replied, her voice flat with exhaustion and grief. Mrs. Jameson paused, looking out the window at the magnificent wolf. I suspected as much, she said softly. Your secret hasn't been as well kept as you might think. She placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. We'll figure something out. For now, Mr. Miller has agreed to come by twice daily to feed her while you're with me. 2 days later, Garrett Sullivan was laid to rest in the small cemetery outside Pine Ridge, his gravesite selected for its view of the mountains he had loved. The service was brief but well-attended, a testament to the quiet respect Garrett had earned despite his reclusive nature. Veterans from 3 counties stood at attention as a bugler played taps, honoring the soldier who had served his country across 2 wars. Sophie stood dry-eyed throughout, accepting condolences with a composure that worried Eleanor Jameson more than tears would have. When the final mourners departed, Sheriff Rivera approached, her official hat held respectfully in her hands. "I'm sorry about your grandfather, Sophie," she said. "He was a good man. I've spoken with social services in Jackson. They're working to locate your mother's sister in Colorado. Until then, the court has appointed Mrs. Jameson as your temporary guardian." Sophie nodded mechanically, her gaze fixed on the fresh mound of earth. "Thank you, Sheriff." As the small group prepared to leave the cemetery, a commotion arose near the tree line. Tom Miller's voice carried across the graveyard, alarm evident in his tone. "What the hell? Is that a wolf?" Everyone turned to see the silver form of Luna emerging from the forest edge, her movements deliberate and focused. Several people backed away instinctively, mothers pulling children behind them. Howard Bennett reached toward his belt where, despite the occasion, he wore his sidearm. "Don't!" Sophie cried, breaking from Eleanor's side and rushing forward. "She won't hurt anyone." Sheriff Rivera moved swiftly, placing herself between Bennett and the approaching wolf. "Stand down, Howard. This is not the time or place." Luna ignored the human's reaction, moving with dignified purpose toward the fresh grave. There, she circled 3 times before settling at the foot of the mound, her golden eyes fixed on Sophie with unmistakable understanding. "She's Sullivan's wolf," someone whispered, the words rippling through the gathered mourners. "The one Miller talked about." "Impossible," another voice countered. "No wild wolf would act like that." Eleanor Jameson stepped forward, placing an arm around Sophie's shoulders. "Not impossible," she said clearly. "Just extraordinary." As darkness fell and the cemetery emptied of people, Luna remained, a silver sentinel over Garrett's final resting place. Sophie, from the back seat of Sheriff Rivera's patrol car, watched the wolf grow smaller in the distance. "Will she be all right?" Eleanor asked softly. "She's protecting him," Sophie replied, the first tears finally slipping down her cheeks. "Like she always has." That night, in Eleanor Jameson's spare bedroom, Sophie finally surrendered to the grief she had been holding at bay. And 10 miles away, beneath a star-filled sky, a solitary howl rose from the cemetery, a sound so laden with sorrow that those who heard it felt its echo in their own hearts. The story of the cemetery wolf spread through Pine Ridge and beyond with the speed that only small-town phenomena can achieve. By the end of the week, Luna's vigil had attracted curious onlookers, amateur photographers, and the inevitable debate about what should be done with a wild predator who refused to leave hallowed ground. "She hasn't moved in 3 days," Sheriff Catherine Rivera reported at the hastily assembled town council meeting. "Doesn't approach people, doesn't threaten anyone. Just lies there at Sullivan's grave and watches." "It's unnatural," Howard Bennett insisted, his weathered face flushed with conviction. "Wolves don't mourn humans. It's either sick or dangerous. Either way, it needs to be removed." "The wolf hasn't broken any laws," Eleanor Jameson countered from her seat beside Sophie, who sat small and silent, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. "And she clearly belongs to Sophie." "Wild animals don't belong to anyone," Bennett shot back. "That's the point. It's not a pet. It's a predator within a half-mile of our town." "Luna," Sophie's voice cut through the debate, surprisingly steady. "Her name is Luna, and she saved my grandfather's life last winter when he got lost in the storm." The lie came easily, a story fabricated to explain the wolf's connection to her family. "That's why she's staying with him now." A hush fell over the town hall as the assembled residents absorbed this new information. Sophie met their gazes with a composure beyond her years, a skill learned from Garrett. Into this charged atmosphere entered Mason Reed, his rental car conspicuously new against the backdrop of Pine Ridge's weathered vehicles. At 32, Reed carried himself with the confident detachment of someone who observed life rather than fully participating in it. His camera equipment, expensive and extensive, marked him as an outsider even before he opened his mouth. "Excuse me," he called from the back of the hall, all heads turning toward the unfamiliar voice. "I'm looking for information about the wolf situation I've been hearing about." Sheriff Rivera straightened, her posture instantly professional. "This is a closed town meeting, sir. I'll be happy to speak with you afterward." Mason Reed, National Wildlife Magazine. He introduced himself, holding up credentials that glinted in the fluorescent lighting. "I was in Yellowstone doing a piece on winter ecology when I heard about your unusual resident. Thought it might make an interesting sidebar." "You're a reporter?" Bennett asked, suspicion evident in his tone. Photojournalist, technically, Reed corrected with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I document wildlife stories across the country. He glanced around the room, his gaze settling on Sophie. Am I correct in understanding that the wolf is somehow connected to this young lady? Eleanor's arm tightened protectively around Sophie's shoulders. This young lady is a minor and not available for interviews. If you want information about the situation, you can speak with me or Sheriff Rivera after the meeting. The following morning, against Eleanor's advice but with Sheriff Rivera present, Sophie agreed to meet Mason Reed at the cemetery. Luna remained where she had been for days, lying sphinx-like at the foot of Garrett's grave, her alert eyes tracking their approach. Remarkable, Reed murmured, raising his camera. May I? Sophie nodded silently, watching as he captured images of Luna from a respectful distance. The wolf acknowledged the stranger with a brief glance before returning her attention to Sophie. How long have you had her? Reed asked, keeping his voice low. My grandfather and I found her last winter, Sophie replied, following the narrative she'd established. She was injured in a trap. We nursed her back to health. And she just stayed? Reed's skepticism was evident. Luna chose us, Sophie said simply. Now she's choosing to stay with him. She gestured toward the grave. Reed studied the girl, his professional instincts telling him there was more to the story. Wild wolves don't typically form attachments to humans this way. It's extremely rare. Luna is extremely rare, Sophie replied, meeting his gaze directly. Will your article help her or hurt her? The directness of the question caught Reed off guard. I'm just documenting an unusual natural phenomenon. There's nothing just about stories, Sophie countered, echoing something her grandfather had often said. They either protect or expose. Which will yours do? Before Reed could respond, the distinctive sound of a hunting rifle being chambered cut through the morning air. Sophie whirled to see the Dawson brothers, notorious local troublemakers, at the cemetery's edge. Figured we'd help solve the town's wolf problem, Cleet Dawson called, raising his rifle. Sheriff Rivera drew her service weapon in one fluid motion. Lower that rifle immediately. This is a cemetery, not a hunting ground. Luna rose to her feet, a low growl vibrating in her chest. Sophie moved instinctively, placing herself between the wolf and the threat. Stand back, girl, the younger Dawson shouted. That thing's wild. It'll turn on you same as anyone. She's under my protection, Sheriff Rivera stated, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority. Lower your weapons now, or I'll arrest you both for discharging firearms within town limits, trespassing, and attempted animal cruelty. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mason Reed stepped forward, his camera raised. I should mention I'm recording this entire interaction, he said calmly, including clear images of two armed men threatening a child and a law enforcement officer in a cemetery. I imagine my editors would find that far more interesting than the wolf story. The Dawsons exchanged glances, calculating their options. Finally, with muttered curses, they lowered their rifles. This isn't over, Cleet spat as they retreated toward their truck. That wolf's a danger waiting to happen. When they had gone, Sophie released a shaky breath. Luna pressed against her side, offering silent comfort. Thank you, she said quietly to Reed. You didn't have to do that. Reed lowered his camera, something shifting in his expression as he looked from the girl to the wolf and back again. Maybe I'm tired of just documenting stories, he replied. Maybe sometimes the story itself asks you to take a side. As they left the cemetery, Sheriff Rivera hung back to speak privately with Reed. Whatever you're writing, remember there's a child's future tangled up in it. Social services is already involved because of her grandfather's death. A wild wolf in the mix won't help her case. Reed watched Sophie walking ahead, her hand resting lightly on Luna's back. What happens to the wolf if the girl goes into the system? Rivera's expression darkened. Nothing good. For either of them. April arrived with the tentative warmth that teases mountain communities before winter makes its final stand. For 2 weeks, an uneasy routine had established itself. Luna maintained her vigil at Garrett's grave from dawn until dusk, becoming a reluctant local attraction. Sophie divided her time between Eleanor Jameson's tidy home in town and daily visits to the cemetery, where she would sit beside Luna, sometimes reading aloud from dog-eared paperbacks. other times simply sharing silent communion with the wolf. Mason Reed had extended his stay in Pine Ridge, taking a room at the town's only motel. His presence had evolved from initial suspicion to cautious acceptance as he spent his days photographing not just Luna, but the rhythms of the small mountain town, always with a respect that surprised the locals who had expected sensationalism. "You still planning to write that article?" Sophie asked him one afternoon as they walked the path from town to the cemetery, Sheriff Rivera following at a discreet distance. A compromise she had negotiated with Eleanor to allow these visits. "The story's changing," Reed admitted, adjusting his camera bag. "Started as a wildlife piece, but it's becoming something else." "What?" Sophie pressed. Reed considered the young girl beside him, her copper hair now pulled back in a practical braid, her eyes carrying a gravity that childhood shouldn't know. "Something about loyalty, I think, and about what happens when the natural world and the human world aren't as separate as we pretend." At the cemetery gate, they found an unfamiliar truck parked haphazardly on the grass. 3 men stood near Garrett's grave, too close to Luna for Sophie's comfort. The wolf was on her feet, hackles raised, her teeth bared in silent warning. "Who are they?" Sophie whispered, instinctively slowing her pace. Reed's expression hardened as he recognized the logo on the truck's door. "Trouble," he muttered. "Stay behind me." As they approached, the tallest of the men turned, a lean figure in his 40s with the weathered complexion of someone who lived outdoors and cold eyes that assessed everything in terms of value. "Well, here she is," he announced to his companions. "The wolf girl herself." Sheriff Rivera stepped forward, her hand resting casually near her holster. "Gentlemen, this is private property. Unless you're here to pay respects, I'll have to ask you to leave." The man produced a business card with practiced smoothness. "Elijah Reeves, Wildlife Solutions. The town council contracted us to assess and remove the predator situation." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "All perfectly legal, Sheriff." "The council made no such decision," Rivera countered, taking the card without looking at it. "Meeting last night. Emergency session," one of the other men supplied. "Called by Howard Bennett. We've got the paperwork in the truck." Sophie stepped around Reed, her face pale but determined. "You can't take Luna." Reeves regarded her with cold amusement. "Luna, is it? Well, now, young lady, this isn't a pet we're talking about. This is a wild animal that poses a public safety risk." "She hasn't threatened anyone," Reed interjected, his camera now hanging ready in his hands. "Yet," Reeves corrected. "These animals are unpredictable. One day they're lying peacefully, the next they're attacking a child who got too close." He returned his attention to Sophie. "You care about your town, don't you? Want everyone to be safe." "Luna would never hurt anyone," Sophie insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Reeves sighed with exaggerated patience. "Tell you what, we're professionals. We'll relocate your wolf humanely. Take her somewhere remote where she can live with her own kind. Wouldn't that be better for her than lying in a graveyard day after day?" "This is about Bennett's missing calves, isn't it?" Rivera asked sharply. He's still convinced wolves are responsible, despite Wildlife Service finding mountain lion tracks. "This is about public safety," Reeves replied smoothly. "We have authorization to tranquilize and remove the animal tomorrow morning. Just giving everyone fair warning." He glanced at Reed's camera. "And I wouldn't recommend documenting it, unless you've got permits to interfere with a wildlife management operation." As the men returned to their truck, Sophie rushed to Luna's side. The wolf pressed against her, still tense, but no longer growling. "They can't do this," she whispered, burying her face in Luna's thick fur. Sheriff Rivera's expression was grim. Bennett must have called an emergency session with only his supporters present. "It's underhanded, but technically legal." She placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. "I'll call an emergency injunction, but these things take time." "We don't have time," Sophie replied, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. "They're coming tomorrow." That evening, as darkness fell, an impromptu gathering formed on Eleanor Jameson's front porch. Reed paced the weathered boards while Sheriff Rivera spoke quietly into her phone, her expression growing increasingly frustrated. "Judge Carson is out of town until Monday," she reported, ending the call. "His clerk won't authorize an emergency injunction without his direct approval. So there's nothing we can do legally?" Eleanor asked, her arm around Sophie's thin shoulders. "Not through official channels, not before morning," Rivera admitted. Reed stopped pacing. What about unofficial channels? I won't break the law, Mr. Reed, Rivera replied sharply. Not breaking, Reed clarified. Bending. Buying time. He turned to Sophie. They can't remove a wolf they can't find. Understanding dawned in Sophie's eyes. We could move Luna tonight. Take her somewhere safe until we can stop them legally. That would be interfering with a wildlife management operation, Rivera pointed out, though her tone lacked conviction. Only if Luna is considered wildlife, Eleanor interjected thoughtfully. But if she's considered Sophie's legal property, a domesticated animal, different rules apply. We'd need documentation, Rivera said, the law enforcement officer in her warring visibly with her sense of justice. Eleanor rose and disappeared into her study, returning moments later with a worn leather folder. Garrett entrusted me with certain papers before his health declined, she explained, extracting several documents. Including these. She laid out what appeared to be veterinary records and a crudely fashioned license for Luna, dated from the previous year, along with photographs of the wolf as a pup during her recovery. He knew this day might come, Eleanor said softly to Sophie. Your grandfather was nothing if not forward-thinking. Rivera examined the papers, her professional mask slipping to reveal a brief smile. These establish prior domestic status. It might be enough to create reasonable doubt about jurisdiction. She looked at Sophie. But if we move her, where would she go? Reeves and his men will check the Sullivan cabin first thing. I know a place, Sophie said with sudden certainty. A cave near Cedar Creek where Grandpa and I used to take shelter during hunting trips. It's hard to find if you don't know it's there. As the clock struck midnight, an unlikely procession made its way through the forest by moonlight. Sheriff Rivera led, having officially gone off duty but wearing her jacket against the night's chill. Sophie followed, a backpack of supplies bouncing against her shoulders. Reed brought up the rear, his camera equipment replaced by emergency provisions Eleanor had insisted they take. Between them padded Luna, moving through the familiar forest with ghostly silence, occasionally pausing to test the air with her sensitive nose. The wolf had come willingly when Sophie called her from the cemetery, as if understanding the urgency of their mission. The cave, when they reached it, proved to be more of a deep rocky overhang above a bend in Cedar Creek, sheltered by dense pines and all, but invisible unless one stood directly before it. Inside, the space opened enough for Luna to move comfortably, with natural chambers extending deeper into the hillside. It's perfect, Sophie declared, arranging a blanket in the driest corner. Luna knows this place. She'll stay here. Rivera checked her watch. Dawn in 5 hours. Reeves will discover she's missing by 6, start searching shortly after. I'll stay with her, Sophie announced, her tone brooking no argument. Absolutely not, Rivera began, but Reed interrupted. I'll stay, he offered. I'm the only one without official connections to the town. If I'm found here with Luna, I'm just a clueless photographer who followed the wolf and got lost. Sophie regarded him skeptically. She might not stay for you. She doesn't know you well enough. Reed considered this, then reached for his camera bag. Then give her a reason to stay, he suggested, extracting a worn flannel shirt. Something with your scent. Understanding, Sophie removed her jacket, wrapping it around a small travel pillow from her backpack. She placed it in the corner where she had prepared Luna's space, then knelt before the wolf. Stay, Luna, she commanded softly, cupping the magnificent animal's face between her small hands. Stay until I come back for you. Luna's golden eyes held Sophie's, an intelligence in them that transcended species. She lowered herself onto the makeshift bed, her massive head coming to rest on her paws in a posture reminiscent of her cemetery vigil. As they left the cave, the first snowflakes of a late-season storm began to fall, erasing their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. Sophie glanced back once to see Reed settling at the cave's entrance, his face illuminated briefly as he checked his phone for reception. Do you think it will work? She asked Sheriff Rivera as they made their way back toward town. I think, Rivera replied carefully, that some bonds can't be broken by paperwork or regulations. She squeezed Sophie's shoulder. And I think your grandfather would be proud of what you did tonight. Above them, the snow fell thicker, a final winter blessing that covered their escape in a blanket of pristine white. The morning dawned with Pine Ridge transformed by 6 inches of fresh snow and the unmistakable sounds of Elijah Reeves's frustration echoing through the cemetery. Where is the damn wolf? his voice carried across the silent gravestones, where a small crowd of townspeople had gathered to witness what had been advertised as the humane removal of the cemetery's unusual guardian. Sheriff Rivera stood with practiced calm near Garrett Sullivan's grave, which now lay empty of its silver sentinel. Appears the wolf has moved on, Mr. Reeves. Wildlife tends to do that. Howard Bennett pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger. This isn't a coincidence. Someone interfered. You got proof of that accusation? Rivera asked mildly, though her eyes held a warning. The girl, Bennett insisted, looking around. Where is she? She knows something. At school, Eleanor Jameson interjected, joining the group. Where children belong on a Tuesday morning. In truth, Sophie sat in Eleanor's kitchen, watching the clock with agonizing intensity. Reed had texted at dawn, Wolf still here. Peaceful night. No signs of pursuit yet. This storm was quite fortunate, Eleanor remarked as she set a mug of hot chocolate before Sophie. Nature has a way of balancing the scales when humans tip them too far. The standoff at the cemetery dissolved into confused milling as Reeves and his men spread out to search the immediate area, finding nothing but snow-covered ground. By noon, they had regrouped at their truck, maps spread across the hood as they plotted a wider search pattern. They won't stop looking, Sophie said quietly when Rivera called with an update. Will they? Not easily, the sheriff confirmed. Reeves has a reputation for always getting his target. Plus, Bennett's paying him a lot of money. Then we need a better solution than hiding, Sophie realized. Luna can't live in a cave forever. That afternoon, as Reeves's team began systematically searching the forest paths leading from town, a new visitor arrived in Pine Ridge. Dr. Olivia Blackwood stepped from her mud-splattered Jeep with the confident movements of someone completely at home in the wilderness. At 45, her face bore the fine lines of a life spent outdoors, and her dark hair was streaked with premature silver that she made no attempt to disguise. The Northern Montana Wolf Sanctuary had begun as Blackwood's doctoral project 15 years earlier and had grown into one of the most respected wolf conservation centers in the country. Now, as she entered the Pine Ridge Sheriff's office, she carried herself with the authority of someone used to being heard. I understand you have a unique situation here, she said without preamble once Rivera had invited her into the private office. A domesticated wolf with strong human bonds, caught in a jurisdictional dispute. Rivera studied the newcomer with cautious interest. News travels fast. Mason Reed and I go back many years, Blackwood explained. He's photographed our sanctuary work extensively. Understanding dawned on Rivera's face. He called you. Last night, Blackwood confirmed. Filled me in on the details, including the rather heavy-handed approach of our colleague Mr. Reeves. She produced a business card and a folder of documentation. I'm here to offer an alternative solution. An hour later, Eleanor's living room had become an impromptu conference center. Dr. Blackwood sat across from Sophie, her manner direct but kind as she explained the sanctuary's work. We provide permanent homes for wolves that can't return to the wild. Animals raised in captivity, injured wolves, those habituated to humans, she explained, showing photographs on her tablet. Our facility covers over 2,000 acres of protected land, with specialized enclosures designed to mimic natural habitats. Would Luna be in a cage? Sophie asked bluntly. Blackwood didn't flinch from the question. Not a cage, no? She would have a large territory shared with compatible wolves, many of whom also have human socialization. But yes, there would be boundaries. She held Sophie's gaze. The alternative is constant danger, from hunters, from territorial wild wolves, from well-meaning but misguided wildlife officials. She'd be safe there? Sophie's voice wavered slightly. Safer than anywhere else she could be, given her unique situation, Blackwood confirmed. And you could visit her. Sophie's head snapped up. Really, we encourage responsible human interaction with our resident wolves, especially those with established bonds. Blackwood's expression softened. Luna's story is extraordinary, Sophie. The kind of loyalty she's shown is rare and precious. At the sanctuary, that bond wouldn't be seen as something to break, but something to honor. The conversation was interrupted by Rivera's arrival, her expression tense. Reeves and his men are expanding their search area. They've already checked the Sullivan cabin and are moving towards Cedar Creek. We need to decide quickly, Blackwood said, her calm demeanor unruffled by the news. I have the proper transportation equipment in my vehicle and all the necessary permits to move Luna legally to the sanctuary. Once she's under our protection, Bennett and Reeves would have no jurisdiction. Sophie rose and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where Luna waited. Can I think about it? Just for a little while. Of course, Blackwood replied. But not too long. Mason can't stay hidden with her indefinitely. Left alone with Eleanor, Sophie finally voiced the fear she'd been holding back. What if she hates it there? What if she misses home? Eleanor sat beside Sophie on the window seat. Your grandfather used to say that home isn't a place. It's the people who make you feel safe. She took Sophie's hands in her own. Luna's home is with you, in her heart. That won't change whether she's here or at the sanctuary. But I'll be leaving too, won't I? Sophie whispered. When they find my aunt in Colorado. Eleanor's silence confirmed what Sophie had suspected. The wheels of the system were turning, and soon she would be placed with her only living relative, a woman she barely remembered from childhood visits. Sometimes, Eleanor finally said, the most loving choice isn't the easiest one. As dusk approached, Reed's texts became more urgent. Movement in the forest. Search patterns getting closer. Decision time. Dr. Blackwood prepared her equipment, a specialized transport crate, sedatives if necessary, documentation that would supersede Reeves's local authorization. Sheriff Rivera coordinated with deputies from the neighboring county to provide an escort once Luna was secured. I'll go get her, Sophie announced as they finalized plans. She'll come for me without fighting. It's too dangerous, Rivera objected. Reeves and his men are out there. So is Mason, trying to protect my wolf, Sophie countered. Luna won't go into that crate for strangers. It has to be me. Blackwood stepped forward. The girl is right. Wolves respond to trust and familiarity. With someone she knows and loves, Luna will cooperate. With strangers, she'll resist, possibly injuring herself or others. I'll take her, Eleanor offered. I can claim we're just out for an evening walk if we're spotted. The forest was eerily quiet as Sophie and Eleanor made their way along the snowy path to Cedar Creek. Twice they stopped and hid as voices carried through the trees. Reeves's men, methodically quartering the area, moving inexorably closer to Luna's hiding place. When they finally reached the cave, they found Reed standing guard at its entrance, his expression relieved at their arrival. Just in time, he whispered. They're less than a mile north and working this way. Inside, Luna rose to greet Sophie, pressing against her with such force that the girl nearly lost her balance. The wolf looked unharmed but restless, clearly sensing the human activity in her forest. We need to go, Eleanor urged. Dr. Blackwood is waiting with the transport at the old logging road, half a mile east. Sophie knelt before Luna, taking the wolf's massive head between her hands as she had done countless times before. We have to leave, girl, she said softly. I've found you a safe place. Somewhere people will understand how special you are. Luna's golden eyes held Sophie's, that unsettling intelligence seeming to process not just the words but the emotion behind them. I'll visit you, Sophie promised, her voice breaking. As often as I can. And when I'm older, maybe I can work there too, helping wolves like you. As they prepared to leave, the sound of approaching voices froze them in place. Reed peered cautiously out, then pulled back quickly. Reeves, he confirmed grimly. They've picked up tracks, probably mine from getting water earlier. We'll have to go the back way, Eleanor decided. Through the creek bed. It's longer, but they won't expect it. With Luna on a makeshift lead fashioned from climbing rope, they slipped out the rear of the cave where the overhang met the hillside. Wading into the freezing creek, they followed its course downstream, the icy water numbing their feet but washing away any scent trail Luna might leave. There, Reed suddenly whispered, pointing to a gap in the trees where the old logging road cut across their path. Parked 50 yards away was Blackwood's Jeep, and beside it, Sheriff Rivera standing watch. But between them and safety stood Howard Bennett, rifle in hand, clearly having anticipated their route. I knew it, he said as they emerged from the creek bed, his rifle not quite pointed at them but held ready. I knew the wolf didn't just disappear. Mr. Bennett, Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the tension. Please step aside. We're resolving this situation legally and humanely. Legal would have been letting Reeves do his job, Bennett countered. Instead, you've all conspired to hide a dangerous predator. Luna growled low in her throat, sensing the threat in Bennett's posture. Sophie placed a restraining hand on the wolf's back. "She's not dangerous," Sophie insisted. "She's loyal and smart and good." "She's a wolf," Bennett stated flatly. "Wild animals don't belong among people. They belong in the wild, or nowhere." "You're right about one thing," came Dr. Blackwood's voice as she approached from the jeep. "Luna is a wolf, and wolves need specialized care when they've been raised among humans." She stopped several yards from Bennett, her posture non-threatening but confident. "That's exactly what my sanctuary provides. Not nowhere, Mr. Bennett. Somewhere specific, designed for exactly this situation." Bennett hesitated, his rifle lowering slightly. "The paperwork is legitimate," Sheriff Rivera called. "I verified it myself. Once Luna crosses county lines under Dr. Blackwood's authority, this becomes a federal wildlife management case, not a local one. Your problem literally disappears," Blackwood added. "No wolf in Pine Ridge, no threat to your cattle, no controversy for your town." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with a disgusted sigh, Bennett lowered his rifle completely. "Get it out of here," he muttered, "and keep it away from my property." As they hurried toward the waiting vehicles, Reed placed a hand briefly on Sophie's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," he said quietly. "Sometimes the best love means letting go." Sophie nodded, tears streaming freely now as the reality of separation hit her fully. Ahead, Dr. Blackwood had opened the specialized transport crate, its interior padded and secure for the long journey north. "It's time," Eleanor whispered gently. Taking a deep breath, Sophie led Luna to the crate. "In, girl," she commanded softly. "It's okay. Go in." Luna hesitated, looking from the crate to Sophie and back again, her wild instincts warring with her trust in the human she loved. "Please," Sophie whispered. "For me." With one final look at Sophie, Luna stepped into the crate, turning once in the confined space before settling on the padded floor, her golden eyes never leaving the girl's face as the door closed between them. 5 years passed like the changing seasons over the Wyoming mountains, sometimes rushing by in brilliant flashes, other times lingering with the heaviness of deep winter snows. Autumn had returned to the Rockies, painting the aspen groves in shimmering gold when Sophie Sullivan, now 16, stepped from a bus at the Pine Ridge station. Eleanor Jameson waited beside her weathered Subaru, her silver hair caught in the October breeze. The years had added a few more lines to her face, but none to her spirit as she embraced Sophie with the fierceness of genuine affection. "Look at you," she said, stepping back to appraise the young woman before her. "Colorado life agrees with you." Sophie smiled, the expression transforming her serious face. No longer the fragile 11-year-old who had left Pine Ridge with her Aunt Maggie, she now carried herself with quiet confidence. Her copper hair was still long but styled more practically, and her lean frame had strengthened from years of hiking the Colorado mountains near her aunt's home in Boulder. "It's good to be back," Sophie replied, scanning the familiar outline of the mountains with visible emotion. "I've missed this place every day." The drive to Eleanor's home passed with comfortable conversation. Sophie's life with her aunt had proven more nurturing than anyone had expected. Maggie Collins, her mother's younger sister, had emerged from her own grief to become the guardian Sophie needed, supportive, understanding, and crucially, willing to maintain the connection to Pine Ridge that kept Sophie anchored to her past. "Sheriff Rivera, Catherine, asked me to tell you she'll stop by tomorrow," Eleanor mentioned as they turned onto the familiar road leading to town. "She's kept an eye on the cabin, you know. Make sure no one bothers the place." Sophie nodded gratefully. The Sullivan cabin remained in a legal trust until her 18th birthday, maintained by funds from her grandfather's modest military pension and occasional rental to carefully vetted hunting guides. "And Mason Reed's latest book is on my coffee table," Eleanor continued. "The photographs are extraordinary. He's really made a name for himself with wildlife conservation work." "I have a copy too," Sophie replied. "He sent it last month for my birthday." His inscription mentioned it all started here. The conversation paused as they passed the Pine Ridge Cemetery. Sophie's gaze lingered on the now familiar headstone visible from the road. Garrett Sullivan, the grandfather who had given her both roots and wings. "I'll take you up there tomorrow," Eleanor offered gently. Later that evening, as sunset cast long shadows across Eleanor's porch, Sophie unpacked the papers she had carried across 3 states. Spread across the kitchen table, they represented both her past and her future. Acceptance letters from the University of Montana's Wildlife Biology program, scholarship offers, and, most importantly, the official internship invitation from the Northern Montana Wolf Sanctuary. Dr. Blackwood was impressed with your application, Eleanor noted, reviewing the sanctuary letterhead. Though I expect your regular visits over the years didn't hurt your chances. Sophie smiled. She says my unique perspective on wolf-human bonding makes me an ideal candidate for their educational outreach program. Twice yearly since leaving Pine Ridge, Sophie had made the journey to the sanctuary, watching as Luna adapted to her new home. The transition hadn't been seamless. The wolf had initially withdrawn, spending days in the farthest corner of her spacious enclosure. But gradually, with patience and the sanctuary's experienced care, Luna had accepted her surroundings. Most remarkably, she had eventually formed bonds with 2 other sanctuary wolves, a male named Storm who had been rescued from an illegal breeding operation, and a younger female called Nova who had been orphaned as a pup. The 3 formed what Dr. Blackwood termed a non-traditional pack structure, with Luna as the unmistakable leader. And Luna? Eleanor asked the question that hovered between them. How did she seem during your last visit? Strong, Sophie replied, her voice soft with memory. Healthy. When I call her, she still comes to the fence immediately. She paused, fingering the silver wolf pendant that never left her neck, a 16th birthday gift from her aunt. But she's different now. More herself, if that makes sense. Less dependent on me. That was always the hope, Eleanor reminded her gently. The following morning dawned clear and cool, perfect hiking weather. After a brief visit to the cemetery, where Sophie placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on her grandfather's grave, she set out alone for the familiar trail leading to the Sullivan cabin. The path felt simultaneously foreign and intimately known, like a recurring dream. 5 years had allowed nature to reclaim some of the trail's edges, but the core route remained, a testament to generations of footsteps pressing the earth into memory. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, looking smaller than Sophie remembered, yet exactly the same. The weathered porch where Garrett had taught her to whittle, the split-rail fence they had repaired together each spring, the woodpile now neatly stacked by Sheriff Rivera's deputy who checked the property monthly. Sophie stood for a long moment, absorbing the flood of emotions that washed over her. Then, with deliberate steps, she crossed the clearing to the structure that had once been Luna's enclosure. The gate hung open now, unnecessary in the wolf's absence, but the space remained, a physical reminder of what had once been. Taking a deep breath, Sophie continued past the cabin towards Cedar Creek, following the path she and Garrett had walked hundreds of times. At the creek's edge, she paused, listening to the eternal conversation between water and stone. Something flickered at the edge of her vision, a movement too deliberate to be wind-stirred branches. Sophie turned slowly, her heart suddenly racing, to find herself regarded by a pair of golden eyes. On the ridge above the creek stood a silver-gray wolf, its massive frame silhouetted against the autumn sky. For a breathless moment, Sophie couldn't move, couldn't even blink, afraid the apparition would vanish. Luna, she whispered, the name carried away by the creek's gentle murmur. The wolf's ears pricked forward at the sound, head tilting in an achingly familiar gesture. Then, with deliberate grace, the animal turned and disappeared into the forest. Sophie scrambled up the ridge, following the direction the wolf had taken, but found nothing in the thick undergrowth. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to confirm what she had seen. That evening, as darkness gathered around Eleanor's kitchen, Sophie recounted her experience, her voice wavering between certainty and doubt. It had to be another wolf, Eleanor reasoned gently. Luna is 300 miles away at the sanctuary. I know what I saw, Sophie insisted. It was her, the crescent marking on her chest, the way she held her head. It was Luna. Sheriff Rivera, who had joined them for dinner, exchanged glances with Eleanor. There have been reports, she admitted cautiously. Hikers seeing a silver wolf in that area over the past few months. I assumed it was part of the pack that ranges north of here. But could it actually be Luna? Sophie pressed. Could she have somehow traveled all that way? It's virtually impossible, Rivera replied. The distance alone, Not to mention the territories of other wolf packs she would have had to cross, and she's been in captivity for years. Sophie fell silent, turning the possibility over in her mind. Then, reaching for her phone, she dialed a number from memory. Dr. Blackwood? It's Sophie Sullivan. I need to ask you something important. When was the last time anyone physically verified Luna's presence in her enclosure? The answer sent a chill down Sophie's spine. 3 months ago? And no one's actually entered the enclosure since then because of Storm's territorial behavior. Her eyes met Rivera's, wide with implication. But the sanctuary staff assumed she was still there because a silver wolf is visible with the pack. After ending the call, Sophie sat in stunned silence. It's still almost certainly a coincidence, Rivera cautioned. Even if Luna somehow escaped the sanctuary, the odds of her finding her way back here. Wolves have been known to travel incredible distances, Sophie countered. And Luna isn't just any wolf. She found her way to Grandpa's grave from 5 miles away. She knows these mountains. What will you do? Eleanor asked quietly. Sophie considered the question, looking out the window toward the mountains now silhouetted against the night sky. Nothing, she finally replied. If it is Luna, she's chosen freedom. That's her right. 2 days later, Sophie stood at the bus station once more, her brief visit to Pine Ridge concluding as she prepared to return to Colorado for her final months of high school before college. You'll be back soon enough, Eleanor reminded her, embracing her tightly. Your mountain is patient. As the bus pulled away, Sophie pressed her face to the window, watching the town recede and the wilderness expand. Near the road's edge, just as the bus crested the hill that would take her away from Pine Ridge, a flash of silver movement caught her eye. A ghostly form pacing the tree line, visible for just a moment before the forest swallowed it again. Sophie smiled, a private understanding settling in her heart. Whether real or imagined, the silver wolf would remain, a guardian spirit of the mountains, a symbol of loyalty that transcended the boundaries between wild and tame, human and animal. In the years that followed, stories continued to circulate in Pine Ridge about the ghost wolf that sometimes appeared near the Sullivan property or at the edge of town during snowstorms. Children claimed it watched over lost hikers, leading them back to trails with its silent presence. Hunters swore it shadowed their movements when they strayed too near the old Sullivan cabin. Sophie, returning each summer to work at the Northern Montana Wolf Sanctuary while completing her degree, neither confirmed nor denied the rumors. But on quiet evenings, she often hiked alone to Cedar Creek, sitting beside the water as darkness gathered. Sometimes, if the night was still and her patience long, she would be rewarded with a glimpse of silver fir among the trees or the distant sound of a solitary howl echoing across the valley. And in those moments, she understood what her grandfather had tried to teach her, that the truest bonds are those that allow for freedom, that love means protecting another's wildness, not possessing it. Luna had given her the greatest gift of all, the understanding that loyalty doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes, it means returning again and again to remind us that we are never truly alone. In the end, the legacy of the mountain wasn't in the story of a girl and her wolf, but in the enduring connection between two souls who had helped each other find their way home. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched this far," and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears in the end screen. It's very exciting.